Seriously guys, what is up with our insatiable need to tweak with a winning formula? When does difficult become fun and easy become humdrum? These are the philosophical questions we probably actually won't be answering today. I'm your narrator Benji, and this is a look-see at what difficulty related options we have at our disposal and what we can do to adapt them to make our time at the table that perfect balance of challenging and enjoyable. So lest you were worried, there will be no teaching of sucking eggs here. Standard difficulty is levels 1 and 2, and expert is 2 and 3, and a stupid 3-card deck. That's all in the rulebook, you can look it up. But FFG have since the game's release officially added more difficulty variants that we're going to discuss, but also what other options are out there in the ether that can spice up your life. In order from easy peasy to hardcore insane then, we have rookie difficulty. Okay, you only have to defeat the level 1 villain and then you win. This is training wheels gone a bit too far for the average player. Granted, you might be a complete newcomer to these types of games, or you want to use this as a platform for younglings to enjoy the game, but most of the time you can skip right past this and start on standard difficulty. At the other end of the spectrum we have heroic modes that take expert difficulty and simply add another encounter card draw to the fill-in phase. Now that's heroic 1, but for the daring that have truly obtained mastery of their chosen identity, you can add as many draws as you like, although no one I've seen has ever mentioned going over heroic 3, which would total a whopping 4 encounter cards per player per turn. Yeah, thanks but no thanks. So those are the commonly recognised variants, and they're all fine, not overly complex, but there is absolutely a difficulty level in there for everyone. I myself most often play my own version of the expert difficulty, in that I face the level 2 and 3 villain, but I do not put the 3-card expert deck in. All the little diddy deck does is amplify the downside of a luck-based draw system. One of the cards forces you to pump or find a side scheme and draw it, which I would argue could have been in the standard 7 cards considering how many player cards interact with side schemes. One mimics the already mentioned heroic mode for 1 turn, and the other turns your identity sideways. Thanks, but I've got my obligation for that. It's not that I'm saying the cards are bad, so much as it feels like an afterthought. One hopes a thoroughly play-tested afterthought, but just needless. I think I'd rather go from my expert to heroic 1 any day of the week. We then move to our unofficial community variant. You've got what's been coined as hazard mode, which really only affects multiplayer and acts as a halfway house between expert and heroic. Here, instead of each player drawing X amount of encounter cards each turn, the extra card or cards are dealt to the table and distributed to the first player and then clockwise around the table until they run out. There are then a plethora of ideas that the community has come up with to spruce up individual scenarios, with a focus of course on the easier ones. But unofficial and fan-made was never meant to be part of the discussion today. Only what options you can look at within the framework of what's in the rules and products themselves. Which brings me to modular sets, and the sound advice, or really just a looming reminder that you should be using these as the primary means to mix things up. You see, almost all villains have pre-assigned modular sets to go with them, which is fine enough. Generally they're thematically and mechanically tied to a given villain and its playstyle. But what happens when a villain modular set combo is just way too hard or too easy for what you would expect from a standard difficulty game of Marvel Champions? Well, FFG can playtest all they like, but creating a perfectly even playing field when it comes to game difficulty is next to impossible. And to be fair, because they implemented these variable difficulty modular sets into the game, they shouldn't be overly criticised for those default choices. Thankfully for the community though, we do have sources, most notably from Dormammu's living spreadsheet that I'll put a link to once again in the description, that allows us to empirically track the relative difficulty of these villains and modular sets by their relative win rates. What this data suggests, and which I think is fairly universally agreed, is that there are some real candidates for scenario tweaking. As such, the aim for this final section of the video is to pair scenarios with modular sets so that the gap in difficulty is narrowed and the difficulty homogenized between all the villains released to date, making each and every one of them a viable challenge. First up then is the villain most everyone played against in their first game. Rhino is basically as vanilla gets, and for good reason. It was meant to be an introduction to the game, but it's also a little bit on the easy side. My suggestion therefore, when Rhino becomes too much like a walk in the park, is to swap out the bomb scare set for the similarly themed Legions of Hydra set from the core box. FFG mentioned right in the rulebook that this is a higher difficulty modular set, and this, based on the average win rates of each, would seem to bring Rhino on a path towards an average difficulty. Next up is Claw, who seems to me at least to be one of the benchmarks for an appropriate level of difficulty, and so is good just where he is. The same can largely be said for Ultron, although he's one of the more gimmicky scenarios with all his poxy drones, and he does buck the trend somewhat in being equally difficult both in solo and multiplayer, as opposed to harder when it's you and yourself. That being said, we're happy with where Ultron's at the moment. Next though came the double the value Green Goblin expansion pack, with the absurdly easy Norman Osborn centric risky business scenario. The Goblin gimmick set that's paired with both the scenarios in the box is just not fit for purpose and can be disposed of post haste. What we're recommending instead is swapping it out for a Mess of Things. Don't get me wrong, it's still relatively easy, but adding Scorpion into the mix is a step in the right direction. The other scenario, Mutagen Formula, is a much better challenge out of the box, with once again Goblin gimmicks, but we're recommending running Interference, with Tombstone as its primary antagonist, or Power Drain with Electro in tow to get things balanced. And so too Wrecking Crew, bless them, which as soon as you know what you're doing is up there with the easiest scenarios ever released. And the problem with tinkering with it is there's no modular sets, including standard in there. So the only thing we can say is flip that Wrecking Crew to the B-side immediately. Yes, you can try Wrecking Crew Extreme, defeating both A and B sides, but that still doesn't detract from the fact that it's not how hard they're hitting, it's the way you have a great deal of control about who's doing the hitting. And then came the first campaign box, Rise of the Red Skull. And thankfully, at least for your patience and my voice, the first three villains in the story, Crossbones, Absorbing Man and Taskmaster, are A, all at a relatively similar difficulty. The problem is that that difficulty is just below the average, and B, it's a big old step up when it comes to villains 4 and 5, Zola and the Red Skull. So after careful consideration, instead of getting creative with the modular sets, we're just going to straight up recommend proceeding to expert mode. And of course, feel free to use the Benji expert mode and leave those 3 wastes of space in the box. Now there will be on this date and at this time no tinker tweaking with Mr. Arnim Zola or Mr. Johann Red Skull Schmidt, because they both offer a suitable challenge on par with what we've been aiming for, which is a give or take 60% win rate. But, and this is a big but, if you very must, you can omit the Hydra Patrol set from the Red Skull encounter. Although at this point we're probably relying a little bit too heavily on the recorded win rates for each modular set. So now we're going to finish this sermon out with a look at the Once and Future Kang, and then you can all skedaddle, because the Galaxy's Most Wanted box set is a little bit too new to reliably assess. Plus, I'm sure none of you are bored of playing the scenarios as instructed, are you now? So Kang, me old mucker, me old pal, well, his temporal modular set is most likely your best bet. Anachronauts increases the difficulty a smidge too far, and Master of Time has Kang minion in it, so that would be a bit silly now, wouldn't it? And so that there concludes the discussion and recommends for today. As you can see, with a little bit of data and a little bit of help from your friendly content creator, we can keep this game of ours balanced and fresh all at the same times. I hope you found all this a little bit interesting. Let me know in the comments if you want to see more of this type of content. I've been your host Benji, and this video is over.